hope that we never lose sight of one thing, that it was all started by a mountain.
The wonderful world of color.
From the beginning of his career to the very end, Walt Disney was never satisfied. He was always restless and constantly on the search for ways to challenge himself and his team of artists. Above all, Walt was a storyteller, and this lifelong search was a quest to push the boundaries of storytelling beyond its imaginable limits. From cartoons to the World's Fair, Walt had already proved to the public that ideas and stories were always flowing from the ever-giving well of imagination. And although he would be approaching the end of his life in the mid-1960s, Walt still exuded a wealth of new and ambitious ideas that would define and redefine how stories could be told. One of these many ideas that has not only left a permanent mark on theme park history, but has excited, haunted, and intrigued our culture as a whole. It has become one of our great American myths, and today, we tell that story.
Matterhorn Matt presents Historyland.
With Disneyland reaching new artistic heights with its 1959 second opening, there was now potential to grow and expand other lands throughout the park. In the late 50s, Walt approached his artists to begin work on a new section of Frontierland. Frontierland was designed to be a land of exploration. It represented an age of braving new frontiers and the myths it instilled in American culture. At the land's forefront was the majestic Rivers of America, representing the famed rivers of the American West: the Columbia, the Missouri, the Rio Grande, and the Mississippi. Frontierland's story is told from the perspective of these rivers, and as a result, Walt saw an opportunity to breathe new life into this story with New Orleans Square. Disney artist Herb Ryman's concept paintings inspired the overall aesthetic and feeling for the land. This new Frontierland extension would be nestled right on the Mississippi riverbank and extend all the way back into the winding alleyways and streets that made up the ornate and lavish buildings of the famous Louisiana city. But even this wasn't enough for Walt. New Orleans had a myth of its own, dark and mysterious myths, some of which had to do with pirates. Artist Sam McKinn initially started work on an underground rogue museum that would feature a wax museum filled with scenes from legendary pirates' lives, such as Captain Blackbeard and Captain Kidd. When construction began in the early 1960s, a hole had been dug for the underground space. But Walt became more and more fascinated with the potential for a possible major pirate attraction. Dissatisfied with previous ideas, Walt turned to artist Mark Davis to design concepts for this future project. The only direction Walt gave to him, however, was to create an attraction with pirates ransacking a town. That was all. Davis hesitantly took on the project, feeling that pirates as a historical subject matter wasn't the kind of stuff Disney dealt in. This hesitation was largely due to the results of his extensive research, in which he discovered that a rogue life at the sea was hardly a romantic one. He learned that contrary to popular belief, pirates historically did not fight in epic sea battles, nor participate in heroic adventures. Quite plainly, they were mercenaries, petty thieves, and drunks who didn't die notorious rebels, but victims of venereal diseases. But Mark still went to the drawing board nonetheless, and designed concepts for what would be a walk-through attraction showcasing different situational scenes in pirates' lives. But whenever he would meet with Walt to discuss the attraction, Walt would ignore and show indifference to his drawings. It could have been that he felt it still wasn't enough to match his vision, but primarily his mind was occupied by the prospect of designing pavilions for the New York World's Fair. New Orleans Square was put on hold, and Mark Davis's attraction was shelved. Could a quaint, detail-driven walkthrough ever see the light of day when WED had audio-animatronic dinosaurs, families, and presidents to design? Or could this World's Fair challenge Walt's artists to once again push the boundaries of animation and storytelling? Even Mark Davis couldn't predict what would eventually happen with his pirates.
Taking a ride, having a treat, moving your feet. I'm going to Disneyland. I'm going to Disneyland. Saying love gets hurt in a magic word. I'm going to Disneyland. I'm going to Disneyland. I'm going to Disneyland.
The New York World's Fair was a success, and Disney's contributions took the country by storm. With plans to bring each of the World's Fair attractions to Disneyland, it was time to work on something new for the park. New Orleans Square was assuredly a go, but Walt wasn't sure Mark Davis's Little Pirate Exhibition could quite match that level of quality and majesty that the World's Fair attraction possessed. With human audio animatronic figures and new ride systems, Mark's designs already seemed outdated, even though it had only been just a few short years since he had sketched the initial concept. Regardless, it was time to go back to the drawing board. This time, Mark Davis and his many collaborators would be inspired by the many artistic discoveries they made at the World's Fair. With Carousel of Progress and Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln, they could now use human figures that could talk and move as close to human beings as possible. Instead of wax figures, they could make their pirates come fully alive to tell their story. But those two attractions were in theaters. Yes, one moved, but not directly into the action. The audience was still an observer. With Bob Gurr's boat canal ride system used for It's a Small World, this problem would be solved. Now the audience would be able to be thrust directly into the story and be fully transported to witness the pirates' lives. With all these elements coming together, there were the makings of a great new Disney attraction. But what of the story? Surely just the exhibition of situational scenes wouldn't do. But at the time, according to Mark, quote, Walt didn't like the idea of telling stories in this medium. It's not a storytelling medium in the sense of a movie. But it does give you experience. You experience the idea of pirates, unquote. With this in mind, what was now a hesitation for Mark was now a revelation. Without disregarding his prior research, Mark realized he could use his masterful sense of visual humor to make fun of these 17th century criminals, not celebrate them. With all these new exciting possibilities, Mark drew his designs that perfectly highlighted who these swashbuckling buccaneers really were. Walt brought animator Xavier X Atencio on board to pen the ride script, and was, like Mark Davis, initially hesitant to do so, because he had spent his time at the studio as a sketch artist, not as a writer. But after Walt encouraged his writing ability after he shared a draft of a scene, Atencio enthusiastically proceeded with the project, but encountered a similar problem that Mark Davis faced. How would guests catch every word the pirates said? Walt proposed a solution. Quote, it's just like going to a cocktail party. You tune in on this conversation, then you tune in on that one over there. Every time you'll come in, you'll hear something completely different, unquote. With his newfound writing abilities, X Atencio also approached Walt about some lyric ideas he had for a song the pirates could possibly sing. After he recited the words, Walt told him to work with staff composer George Bruns to write the music. The two immediately started working on the song that would put to music Mark's humorous visual world and add a vital piece to this new Pirates experience. Master sculptor Blaine Gibson would bring Mark Davis's drawings to the three-dimensional real world, Claude Coates would take his scene sketches and design the ride layout and backgrounds, Alice Davis would design the period-specific and elaborate costumes for the audio animatronic figures, Bob Gurr would enhance the boat canal ride system, and Harriet Burns would build the models. But there was only one problem. In order to get into the underground space where the attraction would be housed, the boats would have to travel down and up a waterfall to and from the space. This new requirement meant that the hole originally dug was all used up. There was now no space for all the big scenes that were planned. The space had to now be expanded under the railroad tracks and into a larger showroom to fit the new scenes. This, of course, led to a new problem. What would fill the space before the main scenes? Walt had previously visited Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico on a few occasions. He was so taken back by the beauty of the place that he once asked to spend the night there. His solution to this new problem would be to have caves and caverns with dead pirates that would eventually transition into the planned scenes. Claude Coates designed the haunting, foreboding cave and cavern layout that would serve as this new first act that would come after his Blue Bayou sequence. Now the attraction had a story. Not just any kind of story, but an experimental story. One in which the audience is the protagonist and their experience is the story. Claude Coates' layout design brought each of the attraction's elements together. The characters, the sets, the dialogue, and the music. Each scene flowed effortlessly into the next, from the swampy Louisiana bayou, to the haunted caves and caverns of the dead pirates, to the lifelike ship battle and Caribbean town, to the fever dream of burning buildings and loot, to the escape back up the waterfall where it all began. Pirates of the Caribbean was born. But in late 1966, Walt fell unexpectedly ill. He was eventually hospitalized and diagnosed with lung cancer. Walt died suddenly on December 15, 1966. The finished attraction opened 3 months later on March 18, 1967, with a large press ceremony and a later televised event. On theme park attractions, Walt once said, quote, "This is the beginning of an entirely new form of art and entertainment, which will eventually take the place beside the theater, opera, and motion pictures," unquote. He had projects lined up to follow Pirates of the Caribbean that would push this idea even farther, with new rides for Disneyland and with plans for Walt Disney World. But how would his team of artists proceed without his guidance? How would their insecurities be quelled and their ambitions encouraged? How would they know what new paths to forge? And where would Walt's Little Pirate Ride fit into this new story for the now fatherless team of artists? The only thing clear in this time of chaos was that a new art was surely born.
Florida's Walt Disney World. There's more new to do in all 3 theme parks this summer. The Magic Kingdom, scream down the world's steepest flume ride, Splash Mountain. Epcot 94, see and touch all the newest video games, electronics, cars, and computers before anyone else at Innovations. The Disney MGM Studios, now twice as big. Let the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror drop you 13 frightening floors. Don't miss any of it. Call 407-WDisney now.
In the years following Walt's death, all the Disney artists, both at the studio and at WED, faced a chaotic period of not knowing what the future of their company would hold. It was hard to determine which projects to take on next without Walt's guidance and vision. But one artist felt confident in his instincts to move on to greater projects. This artist was Mark Davis. He believed the path that Pirates of the Caribbean paved at Disneyland could be just the beginning of a new era for this newfound art. Believing in Walt's artistic ambitions for Walt Disney World, he set out to design a worthy successor to Pirates of the Caribbean for Frontierland. This attraction was the Western River Expedition. Pirates of the Caribbean was not planned for Florida at the time, because the company felt strongly that Walt's wishes for the Magic Kingdom to be different than Disneyland should be fulfilled. However, when the park opened in 1971 without the nationally popular Pirates of the Caribbean, guests felt short-handed. There was a vocal demand for there to be a Florida version of the Pirates ride. This and a number of various other reasons eventually led to a Western River expedition to be put on hold and later scrapped altogether by Mark Davis's retirement in 1977. But back in the early 70s, an upset Mark Davis had to figure out a way to make an attraction specifically designed for New Orleans Square work for a park that didn't have the same theming. The solution was to place the attraction in a Caribbean Plaza section of Adventureland. Because the attraction's thematic setting would now already be in the Caribbean, this meant that the ride would have to be significantly scaled down. There would be no need for the Blue Bayou sequence that transported guests back to when pirates were storming nearby coasts. Now the attraction could start immediately with the grotto, taking guests down only one waterfall and transporting them directly to the Caribbean town. The prologue Mark would design to replace the Blue Bayou sequence would now rest in the ride's queue. Guests would now enter a previously stormed Caribbean fort and be able to see the remains of what occurred. This brought guests down to the loading area, which would set guests off into a smaller scale grotto scene and onto the rest of the attraction. Mark Davis would also design a new finale. The boats would no longer ascend up a waterfall to escape the burning village. Instead, guests would see the pirates with their stolen loot in a treasure room and arrive at a separate unload station from the beginning of the ride. This version of Pirates opened on December 15, 1973 at Walt Disney World and would prove to be just as popular as its Disneyland counterpart. Mark Davis would also reapproach the attraction for Tokyo Disneyland. This time he would keep the Blue Bayou sequence, have only one drop, and keep the separate unloading dock. Even though this would be the final Pirates ride Mark Davis would design, it still proved that it was an attraction that he could never quite rid himself of. He always saw the potential for it to grow and change and challenge itself. In the early 1990s, Imagineers would reimagine the classic attraction to figure out a new way to tell its story for Disneyland Paris. Now guests would start their voyage in the abandoned fortress, fall down a waterfall to see how the fortress got destroyed, and venture through the traditional Caribbean village scenes. After the scene of the sacked town, guests would go down another waterfall and enter the grotto sequence as the finale. At this point, Pirates of the Caribbean had become a cultural fascination. It was an experience from which any story could be interpreted. In the 1990s, with its consistent popularity for over 30 years, Aladdin screenwriters Ted Elliott and Terry Rossio wrote a screenplay for a film adaptation of the beloved attraction. The result was Pirates of the Caribbean: Curse of the Black Pearl. The film proved to be just as popular as the attraction and went on to have 4 additional sequels. With the success and popularity of the films, Walt Disney Imagineering felt the need to bring the new pop culture sensation to the classic Disneyland attraction. Figures of Jack Sparrow would be added in various sequences throughout the ride, as well as Davy Jones and Captain Barbossa. This change remains controversial among fans of the attraction as it seems, to them, inconsistent with its initial creative intentions. This scene would, slowly over the course of 10 years, make its way to the other various versions of the attractions around the world. In Shanghai Disneyland, the newest Disney park, a brand new Pirates ride would be built. This time, it would fully depart itself from its Anaheim original for a ride based solely on the film franchise. Using new projection mapping technology, as well as a brand new ride system, the new attraction mostly awed, but still caused controversy in the Disney community. This wouldn't be the first time controversy would surround the beloved Pirates. In the 1990s at Disneyland, scenes thought to be socially controversial were revised to match the social sensibilities of the time. Today in 2018, we have seen new changes as well. Now, the famous bride auction scene has been significantly altered, and the famous redhead character has been transformed into a pirate. Whether this change is deemed good or bad by the annals of Disney history is still to be determined. But the fact that a theme park attraction is looked up to and expected to listen and adhere to a relevant cultural standard is stunning. Pirates of the Caribbean has proved itself to be an attraction that the public will always deem relevant. no matter what movies are released or what social situations we find ourselves in. It's a vital part of our culture. From theme parks to motion pictures, it contains a mythic and sacred quality in our culture that transcends generational tastes and fashions. It is truly a ride that will never be finished. The morning after Walt Disney visited the Carlsbad Caverns, the tour guide that allowed him to stay the night approached him and asked his thoughts. He said the following, quote, "When you spend the night at a place like this by yourself is when you realize the hand of God is what built this. Man in a million years wouldn't be able to make a scratch of what this room is. You know, I have a place in California called Disneyland. It's nothing compared to this. But I just hope someday people will be able to go there and say, this is a neat place too." Unquote.